just wanted to send a quick...
When starting Resident Evil 7 for the first time, you are greeted by a bright screen and a peppy and upbeat personality within the character of Mia. She's bubbly with high energy, a little ditzy, but showing care to the person she's talking to. She makes some inside jokes between herself and the player character, Ethan. She expresses annoyance about her job, but is still able to find a connection with Ethan. It's light and comforting, and you understand the dynamic between these two characters through the performance of a single character that lasts the span of only 30 seconds. But a few moments later, the mood shifts. It is revealed that Ethan is sitting in a dimly lit room watching two pre-recorded videos. This new setting is the opposite of the welcoming mood from before. While the first video had Mia expressing light annoyance but genuine desire to come back to Ethan, the second video is dark and damp, with a disheveled Mia seemingly frightened in a dramatic situation. The minimum context between the two scenes puts the focus less on the environments, but between the dynamic of the two characters of the scene. The player character Ethan is observing what is the most important person in his life, Mia, in both her best and worst representations to him. There is a high and a low, and the low caps off with the phrase,
"Stay away,"
as the person closest to him shuts him away. It's a brilliant setup for an adventure and journey through the sickly and disturbing Resident Evil 7. The intro establishes all of this through a first-person perspective, giving the player POV and the ability to inhabit the role of Ethan. The cutscene afterwards establishes the setting and the main storyline to the game. Ethan is traveling to Louisiana to find what happened to his wife.
I don't know how, but she's back. She's back somehow.
The email he holds in his inventory is contradictory to the warning earlier, which Ethan laments with his friend on a phone call.
She's not dead. She's alive. She's back. I don't know.
This introduces a tone of mystery, a hint of a sinister underbelly in this location. There's a reason why several horror games rely on mystery and detective work as an overarching narrative. Horror relies on the player's fear of the unknown, and uncovering the unknown signifies progress and provides context for why a protagonist is willingly plunging into hell. This willingness is special for Resident Evil 7, as the mystery is a personal one for Ethan, having affected the most important person in his life. All actions that push narrative and make progress is for a strong personal reason. By the time Ethan has exited the car, it's already clear that there is no hope for any outside help. Civilization is non-existent. You are alone, stepping out into unknown territory. The swamps of Dolby lay before the player, soaked in a dark brown color. Leaves and grass are muddy, flies and cicadas buzz around, and the only light ahead comes from the reveal of the residence the player will be infiltrating. It's unwelcoming, and the buzzing and ambience of the area is hostile and dirty. Yet the player has a mission and must push ahead. Any attempt to peacefully enter the household through the front entrance is foiled by a lock and a broken doorbell system. The only way in would have to be through a different path, and more importantly, without the knowledge of the homeowners. When the player turns away from the gate, the wood on the ground directs the player towards a path to the right. On the way, an empty van shows a sign of life in the setting, but it's abandoned. The seats hold production notes, indicating a film crew is here, but the knowledge that this van remains here, along with the equipment, brings up the question of why this was abandoned. The beaten path is less kept than the path to the house, with high foliage and small ponds with murky swamp water. As you continue, the first sight of danger appears as a man walks up ahead to the right. It confirms that the house is not empty, and the player will have to avoid the people inhabiting. It's a moment of danger that sets stakes for the rest of the sequence, as it's a visual message of the danger that awaits inside the house. Despite the next sequence being devoid of real danger in the form of something that would stop the player's progress, the player has an example of danger existing at some undetermined point in the future, an anxiety implanted into the player in a moment of unexplained fear. Having the player escape danger by being in the right place at the right time is a moment of success, but a lucky one. This man is an ominous threat, a phantom that will exist sometime in the future, but for now will exist in the anxieties of the player's mind as they continue through the opening area. Up until this point, the danger came from the situation, but now there is a physical threat, and all the anxiety and danger of this situation has a physical manifestation. If it wasn't clear that this place is holding something sinister, the mutilated corpses of cows will seal it. The twisted art with blood dripping from the flesh with extra thighs being picked apart by crows nearby show a deranged interest in the rearrangement of limbs and an unethical interest in corpses. It's a moment that shows exactly what the player is buying into, having to only move on by passing underneath, with only a cliff remaining between the trail and the backyard of the residence. There is no way to return, so the player must commit themselves completely. In this moment, the motif of disempowerment supplemented by immediate rewards for doing so is introduced. It was introduced actually even earlier at the gate to the house. The main method of entering the house is denied, but when the player turns around, the wooden path shows where the player should go as a reward. When the player cuts off their way to return to safety and end in the backyard of the house, there is a rewarded proof that Mia has been here with the discovery of her purse. This disempowerment into immediate reward for doing so is vital to the design of Resident Evil 7, as the game seeks to find ways to make the player start thinking within the rules of the game and not in the rules of the player's prior experience. It gives them reasons to move on and face towards an objective, that despite the danger, there is always progress to be made. Stepping out on the back porch shows how disheveled this house is. Despite the previous elaborate piece with the cow legs, there's no indication that someone that organized and precise wants to live neat and clean. Entering the house, the door closes behind you. The bright outdoors is a strong contrast to the now pitch black of the house, a moment where the player is barred from vision until the click and a circular warm light reveals that Ethan has a flashlight. It's a small case of disempowering the player, removing their vision, but rewarding them right after the flashlight and the rest of the house. The house seems even more unkept on the inside than the exterior. Specific animations for objects show the grotesque, stomach-churning aspects of this family, with rotting, filthy objects. The few times Ethan speaks gives a little personality to the silent protagonist.
Fuck!
Items located throughout this location and throughout the rest of the game provides clues and hints to something ominous, all while the protagonist remains mostly silent, leaving the player to piece together the puzzle. This is important to give the player the space and downtime to process the information of this mystery, and to allow for the mystery to remain, mysterious, by never outright explaining the situation immediately. There needs to be synergy between the actions of Ethan and the actions the player wants to accomplish. These clues and hints allow for the player to piece together the puzzle while acting through the role of Ethan. Despite the openness of the gross oddities, there are still locked drawers and cabinets, secrets still to uncover. Vague photos and newspaper readings seem to ask more questions than give a solid answer. The world is grotesque and shocking, but it's clear that someone is certainly still living here. The player's investigations of their surroundings brings them a few notes about the house. The stairs on the second floor to the attic is broken, with the missing fuse being the problem. There is also a tape in the second floor that could be used on the TV found in the living room. And, to the player's surprise, when they use it, it triggers a sequence that pauses the main action and focuses on a new set of protagonists. This sequence is one of the best tonal shifts in a video game, as the lonely atmosphere and quiet of the original protagonist of Ethan is shifted to a louder cast. When the player emerges from the signal, they are greeted by two characters, Andre, a producer, and Peter, a host, who lighten the oppressive atmosphere from before.
Who? Where did you find this guy?
Give me a break, Pete.
Hey, I only work with professionals. Speaking of which, make sure the sound is right this time. I don't want a repeat of Amarillo.
That was 2 fucking years ago.
I don't do ADR.
The two characters are filming a show about spooky residences, and the banter they have about their jobs is a welcome contrast from the problems of Ethan. Yet, the idea that this footage is located inside the house, and the reference to this being taken some time in the past, provides a level of dramatic irony to the situation. The crew is filming a show called Sewer Gators, which is a reference back to the abandoned van located near the outside of the house. The question of how this tape got into the hands of the owners of this house is omnipresent throughout the sequence. The player fills the role of being a cameraman, Clancy, another silent character, but under the context of the setting, Clancy being a cameraman, it makes sense. Giving the player the freedom to assume the role of the cameraman within the legitimate context of the viewpoint of the player being recorded is a genius idea, because it gives the player the opportunity to follow along with the two characters without feeling the need to push forward through the sequence. Control is never taken away from the player, with the only guidance of their actions being dialogue that encourages the player to assume the role of their protagonist.
Clancy, get a shot of this. Let's make a great cutaway.
Giving the player the ability to move around freely also gives freedom to their perspective. Whatever the player chooses to look at is the most important thing for the player to be looking at. The dialogue of the scene is almost constantly present throughout the sequence, something that the player hasn't been familiar with since the beginning of the game. The importance on this difference from the original sequence makes the focus on the characters that much stronger through contrast. The two explain the backstory to the location, but it's through a contextually satisfying way, as background for a film crew. The player hones in on it, as it's one of the few things of information that aligns with both Clancy and Ethan's goals and fills in a few holes of the mystery. The tight corridor of the house makes navigation with other NPCs close together, and you quickly become accustomed to being together and bantering.
Fuck me. I was an anchor, you know?
Weekend sub, Pete. Not anchor.
What's that?
Nothing.
They argue with each other and even diss the player near the beginning, encouraging the player to play the part of a cameraman.
Where did you find this guy?
Give me a break, Pete.
Hey, I only work with professionals.
The banter and light mood get cut short when Andre doesn't respond to Peter.
Andre, what do you think? Andre? Andre! Andre!
Compared to the dialogue that was just filling the air, Andre's lack of a response feels that much stronger. The empty air gives a sense of dread, and since the player had complete freedom to move around and look at anything, they most likely didn't notice Andre's disappearance either. This moment isn't filled with crashing and screaming, but the empty air instead. This next sequence also makes use of what I'm going to be calling the guiding hand, where the player follows a character through a sequence. It happened earlier before entering the house, with Peter and Andre's introduction of the setting, but the player and Peter navigating the next section of the house is almost exclusively in the position of the player being behind Peter. The player's role as a cameraman encourages this behavior of being guided by another character. The purpose of these sequences is to build on the tone of the situation through the reactions and animations of another character. In this case, Peter's movements and dialogue suggest genuine fear towards what lies ahead. His appraisal of Clancy is particularly charismatic.
I mean, producers, they come and go, but a good cameraman like you, Clancy? You stick with me.
Entering the living room, the final place where Andre might be located, and finding nothing is demoralizing and is parallel to the experience of Ethan. However, Peter finds a switch in the fireplace, which opens a secret passage.
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
The passage opened is cramped, especially with Peter. The ladder leading to the basement is foreboding, with the player being unable to see down it fully, even with a first-person angle. Peter's refusal to go down means the player must take steps towards progress instead of being in the comfort of the guiding hand. As the player descends, the camera is limited, meaning scanning the environment while scaling down the ladder is impossible. So when the player finally reaches the bottom and finds Andre staring away from the player, it's the opposite of the comfortable attitude of before. Andre's reveal isn't from him attacking, but by the player's own actions, triggering a cutscene that cuts the sequence with a finishing reminder of the danger of this house. This sequence being mostly without cutscenes except the beginning and end, while giving control to the player throughout, is fantastic because it allows for the player to exist as a character in the world and not as a viewpoint for the player. The role of being a cameraman starts out as a contextual choice, but allowing for the player to fill the role of the cameraman means that the player has a task to do, even if it's a relatively meaningless action in hindsight. The freedom makes the few moments where control is taken away that much more important, and once again, it's a reminder of the nature of disempowerment, as while Clancy's story has ended with his presumed demise, the player returns to the viewpoint of Ethan with new motivation and the knowledge of his secret switch, progressing forward, but not without the knowledge of what came before. The fall of the sewer gators is a reminder of the danger ahead, but an encouraging nudge towards the right direction. Diving deep into the basement is punctuated by the previously stable ladder breaking. No hope to return, only one path forward. The basement is dank, dirty, and waterlogged. Ironically, it's one of the most beautiful uses of the RE engine. The detailed environments of the game come from the use of the Reach for the Moon engine, or RE engine. Yes, that's what it's actually called. When designing and developing the game, Capcom decided to focus on creating detailed lighting and textures using a process called photogrammetry. It's a little too complicated to explain for a video like this, but the simple explanation is that it implements photographic images and interprets it into usable textures, accelerating the process of development. In an annual report in 2016, Capcom described the engine's goal was to enable more realistic graphics that rival live-action film. The engine certainly pushes hardware to its limit, with quality animations and physics as a bonus. For a first-person horror game, the goal to achieve a physical world that would be visually like our own is a strategy that allows for Resident Evil 7 to find horror through extreme detail. As the player takes their time through the basement, the excellent audio design in the game gets a shine as the dripping of the water in this basement, along with the crashing and creaks of the house, always has a presence in the ambience of the game. Going deeper into the basement reveals a flooded lower section, filled with murky water, impossible to see through. If there is anything in the water, the player will not be able to see it, but there is only one way forward. The player must sacrifice the knowledge of what lies ahead in order to move forward, another exercise in disempowerment. The player's view is just barely above the water, and the ceiling is very low. The claustrophobic nature of the sequence and the fear of what could be beyond the murk of the water becomes the focus. The game messes with the player throughout this trek, with bubbles making ripples and audio cues giving fear of the unknown, of what lies beyond the murk. And right before the finish, a body rises to the surface, a final reminder of the consequences of failure. Emerging from the water reveals more clues to this central mystery, with cages and biographies assuming that there are missing persons. Cryptic writing on the wall and imagery of families in childhood is a recurring visual element of the basement sequence, something that is incredibly important to establish now before the later events of the game. Inside one of the cages is the person that you've been looking for, the reason the protagonist is here. Mia has been found. The disempowerment of sifting through the murk has been rewarded. The cage is locked, but searching around finds the bolt cutters you need to break the lock. This area is also a calm environment to help piece together the objects and hints that the player has found during their journey. It gives clues towards the general mystery. There are items in the room itself, such as a list of names with either the phrase dead or turned. A few characters' names are listed on there. Mia's name is not marked, but Andre and Clancy from the Sewer Gator sequence are, showing the treatment of visitors caught by the family of this house, and confirming the idea that this family is performing unethical experiments on people they kidnap, with no regard for harm or death. The silence of this room also provides a quiet place for the player to learn how to experience areas in search of what they need. The game might not always give the luxury to explore in a safe environment, so allowing the player to explore without danger is important to establish. Breaking the lock and making sure Mia is okay does not result in a happy reunion.
Mia, oh thank God I found you. It's me, it's Ethan.
Ethan? Ethan?
Are you alright?
You shouldn't be here.
What do you mean?
The promised happiness of the intro is broken by the sinister nature of the environment the player has been exploring, and Mia's actions being inconsistent. She seems frantic, surprised that Ethan is there to save her, despite sending an email saying otherwise. The concern for Ethan's safety becomes a driving motivation for Mia, as she becomes a guiding hand for the next sequence. Throughout the escape from the basement, Mia is a far cry from the bubbly image of the intro, acting incredulous, silencing Ethan's questions, and delaying the answers to after the escape.
Mia, we have to talk. That message you sent me.
Not me. That wasn't me.
But you did.
I didn't.
Okay, fine. Just tell me what's going on.
I'm telling you everything that I know. We have to go this way.
She moves slowly, with the animators choosing to show her peeking for danger, worried about what's ahead, teaching the player to be careful around every corner. Occasionally, she says something that evokes the cult-like mentality of the family, with a specific word choice being phrases that imply close connections with the family.
We're gonna be a family now that you're here.
When arriving at a dead end, Mia seems paranoid and stops making progress forward.
It's not here. It's gone. It's gone!
It leaves the player to wander around in a side room, specifically finding another piece of imagery within a doll, showcasing that family imagery.
No, leave me alone!
Suddenly, Mia screams and it is implied to be taken away by one of the members of the family. Following the sound leads to the second half of the house, but Mia is still nowhere to be found. This new area is limited in exploration with only a few side rooms, and with no forward progress to go, the player can only wander around until they hear knocking come from the basement they had just escaped from. This technique of allowing the player to explore with nothing to find is for multiple reasons. The first two is to allow for the player to explore and become familiar with the layout before introducing chaotic elements to the scene. The other is to control the pacing of the game. This moment in particular is a moment of downtime from the intense action of suddenly finding the guiding hand of the player taken away. It makes the event that happens when re-entering the basement more powerful. If there was any doubt that this would be an easy and pleasant adventure, Mia's reveal as having been affected by a split personality seals that thought away as she throws Ethan back up the steps with inhuman strength. Before continuing, it's important that when I say split personality, I do not mean it as a derogatory term for those who have dissociative identity disorder. The use of DID or other mental disorders such as schizophrenia in media has always been a controversial issue. Resident Evil 7's depiction of Mia, the next few sequences with this idea of a violent side that breaks out of Mia, continues tropes that those with DID are inherently dangerous and that in the context of multiplicity, any alters to the individual are dangerous. This does not align with those who genuinely have this experience, with most media choosing to only show extreme examples of violence towards others. I encourage those interested in learning more about how DID has been stigmatized by media to take the time to properly research it. There is still a lot we don't understand about DID that has been exploited for entertainment purposes at the cost of the real people who have the condition. This sequence represents a turning point in the game. This is the first time where there is present danger to the player, as the knife in Maya's hand decides to be a knife in Ethan's hand. This moment is scripted, but the button prompt that appears is vague on its purpose, leading to most panicked players likely mashing the button to find any defense in the situation. This is for a purpose, because it allows for the player to align with the panic that Ethan is feeling in this motion. Mashing to escape what is a fast, suddenly adrenaline-filled moment captures the player in a state of purposeful confusion. When the dust settles from this encounter and Mia returns to her original state, the focus is on the pain caused to Ethan and Mia causing pain to herself.
I can hear her. I can feel her clawing her way back inside of me. Get out! Leave me alone! I've been bad. I deserve this.
The ability to revert to her original state gives hope to her safety, but she is knocked out. The player has no choice but to wander around. Medicine found in the bathroom teaches the player how to heal from dangerous encounters. Giving the player room to move around is a moment of downtime, but is suddenly brought to a halt when the player reapproaches Mia.
Leave me!
Who wakes up and throws Ethan through a wall. This battle is different from before, with the player having the ability to freely move and fight back with the assistance of an axe found on the floor. There is no hope to escape without a fight, forcing the player to make the choice to attack Mia. The fight is frantic, bloody. Strikes are tied to music stings, focusing your attention on survival, kill or be killed. But when the final blow lands on Mia, the reality of the situation sets in as she turns back to her original self. Ethan has now killed the most important person in his life.
Hey, baby! I I just wanted to send a quick hello and I love you. Oh, good news. I'm gonna be coming home soon. Yay!
The whole reason Ethan had chosen to go out into a dank, disgusting house was for Mia. And as she slips away, a final hand raise reaches out to the connection built between these two that has now been severed. It's a powerful moment in what is going to be a very campy horror game. The gravity of the situation is broken by a phone ringing. Zoe, the person at the end of the line, informs the player that they need to get out as soon as possible.
You really shouldn't have come here.
With an exit through the attic. As the player returns to where Mia had died on the way to the first half of the house, Mia's body is now missing, with blood seemingly slid across the walls and floor. The previously locked door towards the first half of the house is now unlocked. Using areas the player had already been to in new ways is a great way to make the player move faster through areas. The meticulous nature of prowling through a new area is replaced by the main goal of the sequence, getting out of the house. It's also important to note that the player also gravitates towards areas they haven't explored completely next. The first thing the player could interact after entering the house was a locked cabinet, which can now be broken by the bolt cutters found in the basement, revealing the fuse that would turn on the stairs to the attic, the only way for the player to escape. It's a satisfying victory until the player turns around and sees Mia cross across the hallway in a similar technique to the earlier marsh walk. Danger lurks ahead. After plugging the fuse, the danger comes to fruition with Mia's sudden return. At first her original self, but a quick change back to her violent side ends with Ethan pinned to the wall with a screwdriver.
You shouldn't have done that! It fucking hurts!
As Mia walks away, her laugh and the revving of the chainsaw spells certain doom to the immobile player.
Now, let's see how you feel.
The sequence is an illusion of choice. No matter how hard you struggle, you can't unpin Ethan's hand from the wall until the game allows it. However, similar to the vague axis struggle from earlier, giving the player the ability to use an action that they can see allows for the player to think within the context of the game, that they are trying their damnedest to pull the screwdriver, fueled by the sound and image of an ever-closing revving chainsaw. The sequence ends with a moment of complete chaos as Ethan pulls the screwdriver just in time, but not quick enough to protect his left hand from being completely torn from his body in a gory, incredibly violent moment. At this point, the game does not seem to be using gore and vulgar objects just for shock value. The dismemberment of not just the cow limbs from earlier, but the brutal slice of the main protagonist's hand in a first-person perspective is a choice that aligns with the game's iconography of basing the horror of the game on the experimentation and mutilation of the human body. The sick humor that comes from being able to pick up your own hand is another incredibly important choice, as it establishes that this setting sees one of the most important features and evolutions of the human body as so disposable that it fits in your metaphysical pocket. For the rest of the sequence, the missing hand will be visible on the player's screen, serving as a visual reminder of the danger of this world and the punishment you have taken to continue progressing. It's a visceral image to see in a first-person perspective, what is essentially your own hand cradling your now permanently damaged hand. Despite this loss, you soon get another hand, or rather a handgun, shortly after. This is one of the biggest moments of disempowerment into immediate reward the game has to offer. The game sacrificing one of the most valuable parts of the human body for continued survival has rewarded the player with a weapon to defend themselves, and luckily you only need one hand to use it. It's also a way to increase the value of fighting, as ranged combat is a lot less dangerous than melee. Reaching the attic and ladder to safety is interrupted by the familiar rev of the chainsaw. Your exit is interrupted almost comically as Mia destroys the window and the ladder, kicking the player if they aren't fast enough descending the ladder. This fight uses the gun now blessed on the player for the primary weapon, and despite the tedious reloads, meticulously animated using one hand, this moment is directly important in empowering the player. The use of the weapon shortly after receiving it is a pressured scenario, and despite how slow reloading is, the use of ranged power in this scenario allows for the player to maneuver around the room and even get Mia trapped whipsawing pillars in the room. Eventually, Mia falls, but with no way to escape, the player is forced to wander around until they are wheeled around and knocked out by the father. with the cutscene manipulating the placement of the characters to always have Ethan fall facing Mia, reminding the player why they came here in the first place and the life they will never return to again. The next few cutscenes show the player being dragged deeper into the nightmare of the setting, with Mia shown safe and alive, but still not freed, motivating the player. The hand lost earlier is shown to be reattached, but with visible marks to always serve as a physical reminder of the cost of failure. When Ethan regains his consciousness, the mood of the game dramatically shifts as the camp aspects of the characters are in full force during this family dinner.
Where am I? What the hell?
Rise and shine, sleepyhead. It's time for supper.
The sequence is a cutscene that gives the player the minute control of being a window towards what Ethan is experiencing. The characters introduced are the first time that anything representing normalcy has appeared in the game, but the twisting of the setting and the underbelly of the grotesque is still present, as the player is trapped and forced to experience it, disempowered with inability. The scene in front of you is a family dinner, but the food looks to be anything but edible. Each member of the family is ravenous with incredibly high energy, something that the muted prowl around the house from before is contrasted with. The family that appears before the player is the twisting of the nuclear American family to an extreme. The mother, Margaret, is overly attached to being a caretaker, and when Ethan is rightfully disgusted by the meal made of what appears to be raw organs in front of him, her hysterical cries show a twisted alliance between the grotesque and a familial life.
Oh shit, he's not eating it, Jack! He's not eating it!
Shut the hell up, Marguerite!
Save that for him!
Get the hell out of here!
You're a son of a bitch! Oh,
The son, Lucas, is the extreme of the cocky child. Compared to the standards the rest of the family sets, Lucas is rude and throws chunks of the food at Ethan. Despite this confidence, his role in the family is a victim of abuse, shown primarily when the father, Jack, decides to punish his son's behavior by sawing off Lucas's entire hand. It reflects the event that the player had just gone through just a few minutes earlier, which builds an ironic sympathy, and also is a reminder of what happens to those who upset the family. This moment also serves as a vehicle for establishing the threat of Jack, who will become the main antagonist for the rest of the section. The joy that he has in the abuse and torture of his subjects despite the pain they go through makes clear that his place as the head of the family is absolute, and the abuse of power makes him unstoppable. The final member of the Baker family at the table is only referred to as Grandma Baker, and her appearance at the table seems to only be for twisted purposes, as she appears either catatonic or dead. These moments, along with the clues from exploring the guest house, confirm how this family lives. The disregard they have for human life through the torture of kidnapped persons is directly experienced through Ethan. The meals they consume are vile and show the ambivalence of cleanliness, and the family values that are implanted into the victims are felt directly, as this dinner is a family dinner. Ethan is now part of this family, without his consent, against his will, but the actions of the family treat Ethan as an important individual. Margaret's outcries and hysteria around Ethan's refusal to eat her food is like a son refusing to eat his mother's cooking. The older son picking on his younger brother with less authority is the dynamic that shows between Lucas and Ethan. The father trying to keep order and deliberately punishing Ethan for disrupting the dinner is a father exerting lessons on his offspring, even if it is in a diabolically cruel way. The family is acting like a family, but the negative aspects are brought to an extreme, with each being in a level of hysteria that showcases each one as possessing dangerous qualities, with the one causing the most pain to the player currently being the father. The sequence choosing not to be pre-rendered but a moment of gameplay in-engine with the player able to control the view of Ethan gives the player the ability to be engaged in the sequence. You can't see the entire table and all the participants without moving the camera, and the action is constantly shifting from one side to the next, so the player has agency to move the camera towards the action. The limited control means the focus is on the collective. When they all finally leave and the contextual action of shifting Ethan's chair back and forth before it breaks on the ground, allowing Ethan to escape, the actions and threat of the family isn't separated to another period of time or place, but is more present than ever. The disempowerment from locking the player into a chair and forced to partake in the family dinner has now been rewarded with a chance to escape. The scramble afterwards to find anything to use as defense is heavily contrasted from the power that the gun had allowed the player before. On top of that, with a now present family that, as far as the player knows, is right outside the kitchen doors, searching for defense and ways forward is now with the knowledge that danger is right around the corner, upping the ante compared to the search around the guest house from before. With the tight corridors of the house continuing here, the player has most items easily accessible, and with nowhere else to go within the kitchen and living space of this starting area, the player can only move to the hallway where the family is. There's a potential exit in the garage, but is locked behind a taped console, forcing the player to move down the hallway to the right. While moving down this hallway, there are only two directions for movement, forward and back. When the player moves forward through this hallway, as it's the only direction to go, Jack appearing with a pitchfork begins a chase that starts in an extremely claustrophobic setting.
Slip out before dinner was done?
This danger is more freeform in comparison to the encounters with Mia. With those ending in scripted moments and eventual defense, this chase leaves no power to the player, forcing escape to be the only option. The hallway forces the player to turn around as there is no way for the player to currently pass Jack. The nature of the starting room having two doors means that having a loop to use can switch the positions of these characters. These moments show the player abiding by the laws of environmental design, with the AI-controlled Jack also following the player as well. The player knowing this loop is because of how the game has taught the player how to search locations, and it comes to fruition in this moment. In the lens of environmental design, the choice to include this loop is important because it allows for the player to explore an alternative method of defense, where instead of fighting and defending, the player is focused on creating distance, using the environment in a unique way to escape. This use of concrete environmental design makes this escape satisfying, where the laws of the environment have been used to outsmart this dangerous enemy, with the hallway now being open, and the path previously blocked now also open.
You wasted your time!
So when the father bursts through the wall, completely defiling the laws of this world, the player finds himself in an unwinnable matchup, where common sense and the rules of the setting that have been applied to the player are being ignored by the inhabitants of this world, making these antagonists that much more Goliathan. Jack laughs and finds humor in this uneven situation. To him, this is only a game. When viewing this through the lens of the family concept through the dinner, the idea that this is a father playing a game with his son makes this situation comically sinister. The key on the other side of this hallway that opens the hatch previously locked finds Jack letting Ethan escape. It makes it seem like this game is purposely toying with the player. Letting the player escape here is still a victory for the player though, as it's the first time since the player has found safety since before the dinner. It's much needed downtime as the stress from the dinner erupting into the chase sequence has now concluded in a satisfying escape. The materials found in the storage room at the end of the hatch passageway are health items to heal the player after the damage taken from the chase earlier, rewarding the player for putting themselves in danger. These health items also provide a little tutorial about crafting items and introduces the item box, which teaches the player the importance of limited items in both availability and the limited storage of the player inventory. The downtime in this room also allows for the player to examine more properly some of the objects, particularly a box with a hidden switch that gives the player a lockpick. What's also important in this moment of safety is the introduction of allies to the player. The return of the ringing phone shows a possibility of escape. Zoe as an outside hand helping turn the tide is a reminder that escape truly is possible. It grounds the player towards an objective, that despite the insanity that took place so far, there will be an end. The player leaving this closet and wandering around the area triggers an event where a cop appears at a boarded window near the entrance to the garage.
Open up! Hey, you!
Hey, you gotta help me.
Hold on, back up.
This scene is an ironic dichotomy compared to the conversation with Zoe. While the phone call was a sign of comfort, the cop is tense and does not trust Ethan at all.
Now, we got several calls about some missing persons lately.
You don't understand. I gotta get out of here.
Now, calm down.
You're not listening to me.
This reverse of ideas being so close together is a rise and fall of two examples of escape and outside help, but they have different interactions based on the information available to each character in the conversation they have with Ethan. The cop initially does not trust Ethan in the slightest. He's questioning, and the player recognizes that depending on how this cop thinks of Ethan, there might be a chance of escape. The dialogue is a balancing act. Ethan has to make a case for his own defense, asking the cop for a gun.
Meet me in the garage. We'll talk there.
Hey, wait. You gotta give me your gun.
You must have lost your mind.
Defense is something that the player also needs, which makes this dialogue exchange that much more intense. This moment also serves as a reminder for the turning point of this narrative. Ethan is no longer an outsider in discovering the mystery of what is happening here, but as an active participant and someone who has dived so far into the scenario that he's now practically trapped in it. He has transitioned to be a victim of this family, while the cop is now serving as an outsider, literally being outside the house, questioning to see if Ethan is truly a threat or a genuine victim. It's a moment of intense dramatic irony, with the eventual end being a lucky compromise with a pocket knife.
A fucking pocket knife?
Here. Take it. That's all you're gonna get.
It's not the overwhelming power of the handgun from earlier, but it establishes the character as a potential ally, building on this hope for escape that started with the first escape from Jack. So when the player opens the garage, the scene that lays before him is an initial moment of excitement. The garage door is open, escape at last! The cop rising to meet you is also a final barrier, as the second half of the compromise has turned its head. The hostility to Ethan, arguably rightfully so, is a panicked moment. As the cop questions Ethan, the garage door closes behind.
And tell me, answer my questions.
You're not gonna believe me if I told you.
Try me. Hey, put that door back. Put that door back up. Put that door
The rising action of this sequence climaxes with Jack appearing behind the cop thanks to a smart tactical placement of the first-person camera, and the punctuation of this moment with visceral shock of extreme gore and violence begins a battle against an enemy that seems to break the rules of the world itself.
Fuck it! I'm gonna kill everyone in here!
The player has been taught how to search environments the entire game, so the scramble to find any method of fighting back against this monster comes to fruition in an incredibly intense scenario. The benefits of searching this room reveals the police officer's gun, but it seems almost useless against Jack. There are herbs used for health, ammo for the gun, but the most important item is the key to the car, and the instinct to search the environment is rewarded by giving the player a unique ability to think within the world of the game, and using this key to fight back in this live or die situation. If the player doesn't find this key, a branch grows in the middle of the sequence, as Jack drives the car instead, maniacally drifting and using the same play voice he used earlier, still toying with Ethan even if this play is for sure going to end in a brutal death.
Better start running, man!
If this branch occurs, it sets up the player to look for the key in their next try in this fight, and the absurdity of this particular failure makes frustration minimal. It also teaches the player not to always expect the standard method of killing enemies to always work, once again forcing the player to think within the rules of the game. When the player drives the car, the limited space of the garage and the need to brutally murder your opponent means that smashing the cars into the walls is awkward but tactile, as the smashing and lurching of the camera aligns with the intensity of the situation. It focuses the attention of the player exclusively on the opponent. When he slinks out of view, helped by the first-person view of the car taking up a lot of visual space, and the eventual tear of the roof and Jack dropping down to take the wheel is devastating.
Oh, shit! That's far, Ethan!
Jack seems to be indestructible, and he seems to know it, still teasing the player. When he finally decides to stop, he uses the car on some metal bars in an attempt to kill Ethan. The use of perspective in this moment, as the beam leans out in space and the build-up to the moment of contact is what might be a final moment of torture, as Jack's sadism is punctuated by him delighting in Ethan's fear.
Let's finish this, you and I. Oh yeah, I'm gonna take you for a ride.
No, 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 no!
When the moment finally happens, and the reveal of the father having been the one to suffer, the player finally feels relief. As just a moment ago, it was assured death. The source of danger and fright has been eliminated. As the player exits the car, which then bursts into flames, the player naturally walks away towards the method of escape, a ladder. The player attempts to scale the ladder, but is stopped once again by the father. The moment of hope dwindles away, and a moment of panic ends with a moment of extreme gore.
You're about to see some wonderful. Oh, fuck!
The father's head is blown off, showing pain and a moment of hope for the player that his family is mortal. If there was any thought of using the player's prior experience to think about how this game works, this moment shaves it away, and the laws of this game have fully settled in the player's mind. Enemies come back from the dead, enemies break the laws of physics, injuries are temporary, and the player, despite every single moment of the game being against them and constantly disempowering them, has found a way to progress and defeat their demons. It's a final moment of complete empowerment of the player that seals the player with the tools and habits to guide them through the rest of the game. As they walk through the door to exit this area, revealing the rest of the residents, they hold the keys to success, and despite the yawning, creaking house before them, they are ready for what is up ahead. Hey, thank you for making it to the end of the video. This one took way longer to make than I wanted to, but it's out and I'm actually pretty happy with how it turned out. Thank you to the small community who stuck around despite me not uploading for like 4 months. I have a lot more in the pipeline and the next one won't take a third of a year to release. If you want a hint on what it's about, my avatar is based on one of the creatures from the franchise. If you know, you know. If you liked what you saw and want to see more, I have a video on Fall Guys that might interest you, especially with the recent news of it going free to play. I also recommend liking this video and subscribing. It's the best way to help my channel grow and I would sincerely appreciate it. I'm not someone who actually expects to grow super big off of these kinds of videos, so any positive feedback is always something that makes me feel very happy to see. With only 32 subscribers, it's pretty easy to read every comment. If you're interested in me outside of videos, you can follow me on Twitter or Twitch, which will be in the description. Other than that, hope you have a good day. Cheers.